CCK.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you very much.
We have a fairly small group here, so I'm going to just turn it over to Joe if you want to call on people for questions.
Sure. Larry?
Okay, so I'll just start with this one question. One of the things that weighed heavily on, I think, Zhang Jingguo, particularly at the decision moment, and near the end on the South Korean military, and I think more recently on the Burmese military, was the external environment. I mean, you know, I would say that the KMT regime in Taiwan, actually, it's not that this was, I don't want to overstate it, okay? There was clearly a plan that was unfolding for a long period of time. But when Ambassador Leonard Unger woke up President Zhang Jingguo in the middle of the night in, I think, 1979 to inform him that we were breaking diplomatic relations. And when you look at all the congressional pressure that was coming down around then and in the early 1980s on, you know, and the old controversies, the assassination that happened here in the Bay Area and so on of an opposition leader, if they didn't move in this direction, the relationship with the United States was going to be deeply affected. And if they didn't have the relationship with the United States, man, that's not only not victory confidence, that's not stability confidence, that's no confidence. And then in the Korean situation, when the military had to make the decision they did in 1987, not to use massive force to suppress the demonstrations. If you read George Shultz's memoirs, Turmoil and Triumph, he's got a very revealing discussion of American diplomacy at that moment. And the message that Ronald Reagan, who was not exactly a hardliner in terms of pressuring friendly East Asian authoritarian regimes who were pro-Western, which the South Korean military was, you know, they basically said to the Korean military, you know, it's time. If you use force to suppress the demonstrations, there'll be a heavy price to pay in American ties. Now with Burma it was different. I think they just wanted to get out from under the growing weight. But you see where I'm leading. China is not subject to these international pressures. It's often been the one emanating them rather than receiving them. So is it possible that that really changes the calculus for China? In any case, how are you factoring in the international dimension into your framework, into your book?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I mean, so we look at the external environment as one of four possible signals. And one of the things that we're discussing now, and it has to, I think, you know, we have to be true to the empirics here. We're thinking about if we can sort of think about hierarchy of signals, right? Some signals mean more than others. And I'm not entirely sure that that's the best way to go about it, even though it might provide some more theoretical or explanatory elegance, because for precisely the reasons you say, different situations, right, different kinds of relationships will lead to more or less causal weight for these external environments. I would actually add even another. I mean, part of it is the demonstration effect. So if we're looking at Chun Doo-hwan in the 1980s, right? As he's looking around in 1985, he sees not only parliamentary elections in which the opposition is gaining and the ruling party, the Hanara Party, is declining. He's also seeing Philippines, right? So there is a demonstration effect, right? And he's in the, and you know, in the evidence that we have, the calculation now is we've got the Olympics coming up in '88. We've got Philippines collapsing, and we have diplomatic pressure, and we have the internal kind of clear signaling that we're seeing in the electoral. It wouldn't surprise me, and I'm going to Korea to do some more interviewing, it wouldn't be surprise me if Chun Doo-hwan begins to think about what kind of extrication deal he can make with No Tae-woo, right, in the run-up to June of 1987. We don't know this yet, but you know, it wouldn't surprise me if we do see that. So there, you don't see the kind of so with respect to China then, and I completely buy your argument that we don't have the kind of external pressure, diplomatic pressure, that some of these smaller states in East Asia experience, or Southeast Asia experience. in the 1980s. But we do see, arguably, the kind of demonstration effect, right, that Korea is also seeing in 1985, that CCK is seeing in the early to mid 1980s, and that is to say, there are authoritarian regimes that are dropping and dropping at considerable cost to the regime. So I don't think China is blind to that. So it's a different kind of external. It's not pressure. It's not diplomatic pressure. But it is taking into account the external environment that China is looking around and seeing and factoring into its own cost-benefit analysis. Whether it's compelling enough is another story, right? And so, you know, as I say, I'm very careful in saying our theory would suggest, or our logical explanation would suggest that China would make this decision. But of course, there are a whole bunch of politics going on, right? And so you're seeing the buttressing of an extraordinarily hardcore nationalist discourse in China right now. You're seeing, in some ways, or we have seen an effort to fashion a kind of soft power projection around these very norms and around some sense of an essence of what it means to be China. All these sorts of things to try to combat this. So it may be that external pressure and the demonstration effect may not have much effect in the end politically. But it's still there. I think it's still there. And I think they're considering it. Don?
If I could just start abstract and hopefully in a reasonably brief question.
Now, you're being the best student produced by Ed Friedman. You better inherit his tripartite concept. the Beijing-Hong Kong-Taipei dialectical relationship. And also being at UT, at least 1/3, if not 1/2 of your students have Hong Kong background.
Right.
So you better be prepared. From what happened 2 days ago, Wednesday, when C.Y. Leung, Hong Kong Chief Executive, presented his annual policy speech, State of the Union, or Disunion, he reflected Beijing's status now. Because Beijing's verdict was the March Sunflower Movement Taiwan, impact very directly the so-called radical student that turned the yellow umbrella into the Hong Kong crisis.
Right.
And the leaders, most of the leaders of the Taiwan movement had what I call solid green or light green tendencies. So C.Y. Leung's speech, which is yet to be analyzed by anybody in the U.S., picked on one of the University of Hong Kong student magazine that deliberately talk about the theoretical concept of Hong Kong autonomy, and Beijing treats it as Hong Kong independent, Hong Kong separatism. So in some sense, Hong Kong is really tightly controlled by Xi Jinping, at least during his first term. Sure. The hope is maybe the second term when he's more relaxed, and also during Xi Jinping's second term, you probably know better, it's quite likely the next president sitting in Taipei would be a green president rather than blue president.
Right.
Then he may have, Xi Jinping, had to confront the real possibility of a democratized Taiwan, but is having a second form of the so-called Chinese identity.
Right.
And then the problem of today, as of yesterday also, the C.Y. Leung speech was clear in advance by Beijing, 2 weeks rather than the normal 1 week. And it was Beijing's line to condemn Hong Kong student magazine talk about, autonomy and Beijing choosing. So the latest bottom line, using your title, but just, Beijing want everybody, including those in Hong Kong, Macau, to unlearn the Taiwan story.
Right.
It's not that much democratization, but they thought the local identity or even autonomy, assertiveness, actually. So the problem is Xi Jinping could not afford to let go of Hong Kong for the point, but could not deliver in that tenement because he could ruin 35 years of Deng Xiaoping reform, one country system, globalization, because he is insecure at home. But what happened if he's secure and the second term, and also his second term had C.Y. Leung would be out of the picture. He is unrepackageable for a second term himself, and then Taiwan would have a green presidency. Then maybe, now this is putting your theory in another spin, maybe the second term Xi Jinping offer a little bit second thought on your theory.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts here. I mean, I think what we're seeing with Xi Jinping right now in Beijing, and probably to the surprise of many who might have had higher expectations for the Xi administration, is really a lack of confidence. Right? And that's why I put that quote from the New York Times, because I think it very much captures. I forget who wrote it now. It might have been actually a Times editorial, but it captures the lack of confidence that Beijing has, and it's behaving in a way that betrays that kind of lack of confidence on the part of Beijing. And according to our
person,
well, himself, yeah,
mm-hmm.
in his administration, and that according to our logic, our theory, is very dangerous, right? Because if he begins to think that he has no other choice but to hang on,
and hang tough,
then we would expect continued repression, right? So now, that said, there is an argument out there that says, well, he's just consolidating his power, and once he feels secure, then in term 2 he might that kind of power and strength is, if you parse when we talk about strengths and antecedent strengths, that's not the kind of strength that we're talking about. That's the kind of consolidation of power through these coercive mechanisms. The way in which we see Taiwan, right? The way in which I describe the antecedent strengths in Taiwan, in no way forgiving of its autocratic past, but nonetheless, its strengths were not, I didn't talk about its coercive capacities, but rather its usable past with respect to economic development, having created a thickened middle class, a relatively conservative voter that it could count on voting for the KMT if it were to concede. This was actually very much so in the case of Korea as well. I mean, the protesters that were out in the street and everywhere between 80 and the culmination of 87, right? These protesters, a good portion of them, once they went back off the streets, voted for the ruling party, right? So that's a different kind of antecedent strength than the kind of power that arguably Xi Jinping is trying to amass now. So on balance, look, politics is unpredictable, but on balance, according to our, this logic, this theory, I wouldn't expect. I think that this is a sign of tremendous lack of confidence.
I compare him, the so-called underground, to the Stalinist purge.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So there is not a Maoist reincarnation in Xi Jinping,
right,
but a neo-Stalinist.
Right.
That's what I saw so far.